Sean Kevelighan with the III. Thank you for joining us today for another executive exchange. Joining us, fortunately, we have Bill Donnell, President and CEO of the National Council on Compensation Insurance, NCCI as we call it in the industry. Bill, thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you and talk about workers' compensation.
Thank you, Sean. I'm glad to be here today.
Great. Bill, we've been in large part in a hard market in this industry of late, with the exception of workers' compensation. So can you help us understand a little bit about what's going on in the workers' comp system?
Sure, Sean. And by the way, that's a very good question. That's a question that we get quite often, from carrier executives. Workers' compensation rates have been trending down, unlike other lines in the marketplace. And the question we get related to what you said is, when we talk to insurance executives and workers' comp, the question is, how long can this continue? Are the rates adequate? So here's the answer when we start with the data. First of all, the headline is that the system, workers' compensation system, remains strong and relevant. There's been 7 consecutive years of underwriting gains and favorable combined ratios. And the other thing we looked at is the reserve position. And so at the end of 2020, the reserve position was $14 billion in redundancy. So the headline, again, is despite several years of declines in loss costs and rates, that the system is still, it's a resilient system. Rate adequacy is something we look at all the time, regardless of the cycle. And we're just not seeing those trends that give us major concern right now, because we see a reduction in frequency and we're seeing moderate medical inflation.
Interesting. So let's look back at the last couple of years. Obviously, the COVID-19 has been devastating for Americans and obviously around the world as well. We had a fear in the beginning of COVID-19 that this would be also devastating for the workers' compensation system. But tell me a little bit in your mind how the pandemic has impacted workers' compensation.
Sure. Another good question, Sean. So we had the same observation. Early days in the spring of 2020, when things were playing out, there were some pretty dire estimates of what was happening. And it has not turned out that way. It's been much, much more moderate. I would qualify that by saying that it has been devastating for certain segments of our population of the workforce, certainly frontline healthcare workers, first responders. There's a lot of tragedy there. There's a lot of difficult stories there, and I don't want to underestimate that. But for the system as a whole, it has not played out that way. We did a research project with 9 independent bureaus. Recently was published in 45 jurisdictions. Some of the current numbers that rolled up that kind of validated what we saw in the NCCI states was about $630 million in COVID incurred loss dollars, about 80,000 claims, an average cost that's under $8,000, mostly indemnity expense. And so those estimates where we stand now were certainly not as dire, to use that term again, as we did early on. Having said that, there's still some uncertainty in the system. We still have uncertainty relating to the infections and this concept of long COVID. And then the next piece is that these numbers are really going back to, they represent workers, and many of them that we're still talking about have been in serious situations. So still something we're watching very carefully, but clearly not as dire as we had originally estimated.
Very good. Yeah, it is interesting how the workers' compensation and the claims amount have shook out through the years. And obviously, COVID is still very much on our minds with Omicron in this day and age and this time of year. But what else are you hearing in terms of concerns relevant to workers' compensation now?
Sure. So we do a survey once a year, and it's been interesting to watch how different items have bubbled to the top. There's a couple things that I would share with you, Sean. One is this concept of the great reshuffle, and what that means is that workers on the move, whether they're resigning from their current job or going elsewhere, or picking up and moving to a new geographic location. But this idea, the headline of a great reshuffle. Why this is important to workers' compensation is that when we look back over history and look back, say after the Great Recession, you had a situation coming out of that where you had new workers. So new workers are perhaps not as in tune with worker safety practices from their employer. Unskilled workers, particularly those in the higher hazard job classification, inexperienced workers, same thing applies. And so those types of things, based upon history, would indicate that there's a greater chance of losses, greater chance of loss frequency that could perhaps bend this long-term secular decline that we've seen on loss frequency. Related to that is labor participation. We've noticed that women, as reported, are often making the choice to leave the workforce. So the workforce is changing. We continue to monitor it, and we did an update about mid-year 2021. There'll be another one, and I know that the III spends a lot of time on this as well. So it's really an important topic that we look at it. The point is that there are so many dynamics in play that are new to us and changing, despite the history, that I would say that probably for now versus a long time ago, we're seeing more knowns than knowns in recent memory relative to that. The second thing is medical inflation. There's a lot of headlines on inflation in general. And I've read things recently where it's the highest in 40 years. Yes. But when we look at the factors that are impacting medical inflation and the actual results, it's muted. It's a 2 to 2.5% range. So it's not following the same trends that we're seeing elsewhere for different reasons. When we look, if I look back over a long period of time, which in this line makes sense because it's a long tail, and I look at the last 20 years, the first 10 years of the century, there was a lot of medical inflation. So 2000 to 2010, coming out of the Great Recession. And then the last 10 years, it's been muted. So why is that? One of the things that we're seeing is that the carriers have benefited from fee schedules, medical fee schedules in states. And that factor didn't exist in the first 10 years versus the last 10 years. The other is nurse case management by carriers. So those things are really important, and they've had a significant impact, in our view, on medical inflation overall. So the medical inflation is something we'll continue to watch. It remains a wild card because it could turn things significantly, but it's something we're always watching, we're paying attention to, and we're hoping for continued muted medical inflation.
So interesting. Such an interesting dynamic happening today in our workforce. So much change happening. Really, you guys clearly have your finger on the pulse on this. At III, we try and have our mission centered on informing important discussions, making people appreciate what insurance is and does for our society. In your mind, what can we do in an industry specific to workers' compensation to make sure people understand the important role it plays and insofar as staying relevant, if you will?
You know, that's really important, Sean. We have a system that's been around north of 100 years. My company, NCCI, is celebrating 99 years in 2022 and then 100. So we think a lot about that as well. And in the workers' compensation system, it's really important. How does the system that's been around for 100 years, how does it maintain its relevance? I would say there's probably a couple things. One is, and these are long-term central to, I believe, relevance in the long term. One is to anticipate the needs of the stakeholders in the system. So always think about what can we do to address pain points? What can we do to modernize our systems? What can we do to bring more value to the stakeholders? You know, data is a really important central part of what we do. So I think modernization, better analytics, better analysis, and it sounds simple, right? So it's a very simple goal, but the fact is that it's going to take modernization of systems. It's going to take innovation, which by itself is very, very difficult and has proven difficult in our industry. And then leveraging the data. There's a lot of data that exists in our system, outside the system, bringing it in. And we think that relevance is very, very central to doing those things. The other is, and I give Triple I credit because you've pointed this out, Sean, is this idea we have to hire the best people. And there's a war for talent going on within the industry and then outside of the industry right now. So we've got to have the right talent. In my view, and I've been in this industry for a long time, is it's a very interesting industry. We've got to sell it better, the jobs that exist. We have to attract the best talent because that's going to help us transition to the future. The last piece for me is that, and I think about this a lot, is that, focusing on what matters. We have this noble mission, right, to help injured workers and their families. I can't think of a more noble mission than that one. And so if we're trying to sell our industry to the best talent, and we can always remain focused on why we exist, I think we've got a long-term success in the future will remain relevant. So it's about modernizing data and analysis. It's about attracting the best talent and never losing focus of why we exist, which is to help the injured worker and the family. So we've done a very good job of that over a long period of time. And I anticipate that we'll do it going forward in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Workers' compensation system being 100 years relevant, insurance being 300 years,
sure.
With a 300-year history.
Yep.
So it's very important to society. It's what keeps our economy growing. It's what keeps people working in your case. So a lot of good insight here, Bill. Really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate it as well, everybody joining us for another executive exchange. So, Bill, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.